One of the greatest things about working with clay is the simple fact that any scraps you end up with throughout the making process can easily just be recycled and reused and eventually thrown into new pots. This recyclable waste can come from numerous places, the most prevalent being from the trimming process, where layers of leather hard clay are trimmed away from the pots that fill up the wheel tray with thin coils of clay. As they're so thin and disintegrate really easily, I immediately just chuck them into the reclaim bucket that lives next to my wheel, and any time my tray gets full, I simply just dump them straight into it. Anything thicker than these turnings, say a larger chunk of leather hard clay, I'll never throw that directly into the reclaim bucket if it's still slightly wet, as it'll take weeks to degrade to a point where it can be recycled nicely. So instead I'll let it turn completely bone dry before placing it into this bucket. I also add things like the slops left over from my throwing water, and when all these trimmings and other bits of waste are soaked overnight, it will slake down into a fine slurry. Whenever I'm throwing pots, if I need to remove the slip off my hands, I do so against this sharp edge of a bucket filled with water. Then, at the end of the day, once I've finished throwing all my pots, I'll sponge down the wheel, and then I'll clean all of my tools, and I'll wring out the sponge in that same bucket of water. Even though I have a clay trap under the sink in my studio, I still wash all of my tools and sponges and towels and things in this bucket of water first. I also don't necessarily worry about cleaning every tool perfectly, as under normal circumstances I'm probably going to use them in the next few days. I'll lay out all of these washed tools on a cloth to dry overnight, and at the same time all the clay will settle in a layer at the bottom. The following morning, I then carefully pour away the water, trying my very best not to disturb the settled clay in the bottom. I swirl together what's left, and then this, once again, is added to my reclaim bucket. And then, if it's another day of throwing, I'll simply keep this bucket by my side, full of fresh water, ready so I can scrape the slip off my hands against its sharp edge, and the whole process starts again. After a week, or maybe two, of throwing and trimming, the bucket usually gets full. I then use a large sponge to remove as much excess water from the top as possible, which I wring out in my other bucket of water that will eventually get added back to this. I then drag the bucket over to my plaster bats, which are made from a mixture of 80% potter's plaster and 20% casting plaster for strength. I place these plaster bats onto 3 kiln props so air can get beneath them and help dry them out. They're heavy, thick bats that will absorb a lot of water from the clay that's placed onto it, yet they can still quickly become saturated, and from time to time, when they're not in use, I'll either take them outside to sit in the sun, or I'll place them underneath my gas kiln when I'm firing it. I used to prop them up with wooden slats, but they quickly become very mouldy, whereas these kiln props can't. They're also given a scrub clean every now and then to dislodge any loose plaster that might find its way into your clay body, which you definitely want to try and avoid, as small specks of plaster lodged in clay, once fired, can cause the clay and glaze above it to shear off, which is something potters call lime popping. So if you do recycle your clay like this, and you find a little hard bead of white in your clay, it's best to remove it. Otherwise, I liberally scoop all the clay out onto the bat in a thick layer, which I distribute evenly across the slab. If you want, you can put a layer of canvas down between the clay and the plaster, which helps prevent plaster from getting stuck into the clay. It can also make lifting the heavy slab away once it's dry enough just a bit easier. And in the winter I place these clay-laden slabs directly next to the heater, just to help it dry out a bit quicker. I then smooth out the exposed surface on both the top and the sides. If you are in more of a rush, although I can't say how much it truly helps, once all smoothed out, you can poke finger holes throughout it so air can get into the massive clay and help dry it out. But I just tend to leave it completely smooth, and if the clay does get to a point where the part touching the slab is drier than the clay above, then I'll just flip the entire piece of clay over. But in these hotter months, that doesn't really happen, and the whole lot tends to dry out quite evenly. I only ever use one hand to do this. That way my other one stays clean and can do things like turn the tap on or move the bucket without simply spreading the mess even further. And instead of washing this hand in the sink, I first scrape as much of the clay off as I can and then rinse the rest off with a sponge in my other bucket full of water, all to try and minimise how much clay goes into the sink into the clay trap and eventually down the drain where it could cause a blockage in the long term. A few days later, once the clay is firmed up considerably, I'll peel it off the batt and move it over to the workbench. And if I ever need to delay this process, I'll wrap the slab of clay in plastic or simply drape it over it and give it a few good sprays with water if, say, I need to leave it over the weekend. The truth is you'll find the best way of dealing with it in your own studio, and that'll likely come with quite a lot of trial and error too. Once I've moved the slabs onto the workbench, I then slice them up into a bunch of chunks like so. I try to mix up the slabs, wedging together one piece from each, and if one slab is softer than the other, then I'll mix one soft with one firm. Personally, I try to mix my reclaim up when it's a bit on the soft side. That way I've got a supply of very soft, malleable clay that's very useful for throwing into bowls and plates, and pots that don't require much height. Plus, it means I have some soft clay available to mix with any firmer bags I might have that might otherwise be unusable. Next, the wedging can begin, and to do this, I stand on a few boards, which raises me up so my pelvis is more or less completely level with the workbench, which means that when it comes to spiral wedging the clay, I can use more of my upper body weight to push down onto the clay rather than relying solely on using my muscles in my arms and shoulders, which ultimately means I can wedge for longer periods of time without getting tired. It can sometimes be a bit tricky to manoeuvre at the beginning, as the outside of these slabs can form a sort of hard shell, but as soon as that starts to mix in with the softer clay within, it should become easier. And for this batch of clay, I spiral wedge the whole lot, which is a technique I've covered in a lot more detail in another video, which I'll leave a link to on screen now and in the description below. But put simply, it's the process of folding and rotating the clay in such a way that the clay is pressed into a spiral underneath my hands. It gets ever smaller and smaller, and as it does, any pockets of air left inside are stretched and popped, and any hard sections are mixed with the softer sections, and ultimately we're left with clay that's completely smooth and even in texture, and is totally void of any pockets of air. Well, I say totally, but it's quite normal not to eliminate all of them. If left unchecked though, and your clay is riddled with them, it can make the process of throwing pots far more difficult. If you're lucky enough to own a de-airing pug mill, you can use that too, and one of those is still on my wish list for new pieces of equipment for my studio. As I wedge, the clay turns from feeling slightly crumbly and being chock full of little holes and indentations into a much smoother condition, and I can almost begin to feel when it's wedged enough. And if you aren't sure, simply cut your lump of clay in half, and if you can see lots of pockets of air in the cross section, then it means you need to continue wedging. It's a very good skill to have though, and to some degree I think it's important to not become reliant on using a pug mill, as wedging clay by hand, like this, is one of the fundamental skills you should have as a potter. If I'm going to be storing the clay away for a while, once wedged up, I'll work it into a block-like shape so they can be stacked and stored away more easily. This isn't, though, the only way of hand wedging clay. You can also use the ram's head method, and you can cut wedge too, both of which are techniques I hope to make videos about in the future. As a task, the process of recycling clay is a constant, and keeping on top of it and not letting endless buckets slowly pile up is an important part of being a potter. And although clay isn't the most expensive raw material, especially in comparison to some other crafts, it's still better to reclaim and reuse it, rather than just discarding all of your waste. If you find that your clay is too firm to wedge by hand, and you'll know if it is if your wrists begin to really ache and hurt, then it's best to stop and either cut the clay into lots of thin slabs, soak them in water, or wrap them in wet towels until the clay is soft enough to wedge properly, or you can just stick the entire slab back onto the radiator, let it go bone dry again, and slake it down in water, repeating the process. I say this because I've hurt my wrists in the past by wedging clay that's far too firm, and they've been painful and ached for a week after. But the best thing you can do in terms of posture is to raise yourself up. It honestly makes such a difference, and you don't want the tabletop to be either too low or too high, as otherwise you're having to move your body into uncomfortable positions just in order to wedge your clay. Once I'm finished, I store my boards away and then give the table a thorough scrape down and clean. And all of these scraps, once again, are thrown back into my reclaim bucket. And then to stop all the clay from drying out and creating dust, I always thoroughly wipe down all my surfaces. The same goes for cleaning around my wheel, typically. If there's any larger chunks of clay on the floor, I'll pick them up and put them into the reclaim bucket. And then I give the area a quick mop just to get rid of the worst of the dust. For those who don't know, clay dust isn't particularly good for your lungs, and with a lot of exposure, you can develop silicosis, a lung disease that can be fatal. And I've always thought that since I've begun this craft from such a young age, I do need to be careful, as in the long run, I probably will have a bit more exposure than most people. Once the studio's clean, I lay out a piece of plastic and I'll move the wedged up blocks onto it. 3 years ago I purchased a roll of dry cleaners plastic. That's where I get my plastic sheeting from, and 3 years later that roll has still barely been used up. So I'll stack this clay and I'll wrap it up tightly so no drafts or air can get to it and dry it out. And if I'm going to store it for a longer period of time, I'll place these blocks into a sealed container which I spray with water and has an airtight lid. But if I'm going to be using it quickly, like I was with this stuff, I'll just leave it wrapped up like this, and then the following day the pieces can be weighed out, the stoneware then wedged up once again and thrown into hundreds of new pots. And once again all of these new pots will be trimmed, and the waste from these will undergo the exact same recycling process, with new clay from freshly opened bags being added to it in a cycle that's forever ongoing. Thanks for watching. And I know this is a topic I've covered before, but my process of making pottery is highly repetitive, and hopefully this video sheds some light on it in a way that my previous didn't, as my methods have changed and developed with time.